Earlier today, SoFi saw their second major executive departure in the past 2 weeks alone. First, they had Aaron Webster, their former chief risk officer, who left the company to join PayPal. And earlier today, we saw the departure of the second executive, Chad Borton, the president of SoFi Bank. Obviously, not great to see. Let's jump right into it. Okay, so jumping straight into this news earlier today, it came in the form of an 8K filing which dropped on the SoFi Investor Relations page around 6 a.m. Eastern Time. The 8K filing highlighted the departure of Chad Borton, the president of SoFi Bank and an executive vice president at SoFi. Per this 8K, notice was provided on March 21st. So this actually happened 5 days ago when the notice was provided to the company with the intention to resign. And the news is only dropping today, 5 days later. Looking over the 8K filing together, we can see that the effective date is April the 12th, meaning that Chad Borton will still be with the company for the next 2 to 3 weeks, presumably to oversee the transition, handing off responsibilities, and supporting in that process in general. The 8K also highlights that the resignation was to pursue other opportunities and not the result of any dispute or disargument with the company or company operations or policies. So basically saying it was amicable and he's simply looking for another job. Now, this piece around pursuing other opportunities is interesting because that's also what Aaron Webster's 8K said. Shortly after, what we saw Alex Chriss, the CEO of PayPal, make a post that Aaron Webster had joined PayPal as one of their SVPs. And so just putting two and two together here, if we take Aaron Webster's departure as a template and we apply it to Chad Borton, the main thing that I'm thinking about right now is whether we're going to see Chad Borton announce that he is starting somewhere else at another organization. I'm not sure. I wouldn't be surprised if the other shoe drops in the next couple of weeks and we see that Chad Borton had another opportunity lined up already, and it's just a matter of waiting for that to be announced. However, the other reason why this is interesting is because there was some chatter around Chad Borton's role at SoFi coming out of retirement to essentially help SoFi's bank side of the business in the setup phase, which makes it a little bit suspicious, let's say. At the very least, it makes it interesting that the filing says to pursue other opportunities, because if this is an individual that came out of retirement and wanted to pursue this opportunity with SoFi, then we can assume two things. Number one, that this is a temporary thing, that he wanted to see this through, have a seamless transition in the setup phase. And number two, that he would go back into that retirement phase. But pursuing other opportunities sort of goes against that grain. But again, that was just chatter, and it wasn't really confirmed that Chad Borton had a temporary contract with SoFi. There are hints that point us in that direction, but that's speculation. Okay, going through the 8K, the second paragraph here highlights that the duties and responsibilities as the SoFi Bank president will be assumed by Paul Mayer, who is currently the vice president of SoFi Bank and a member of the SoFi Bank board of directors. Mr. Borton's other duties and responsibilities will be assumed by other officers of the company, and the company is pursuing a search for his permanent replacement for those duties and responsibilities. Okay, so a few new pieces of information in this second paragraph. Number one, we asked the question, who is Paul Mayer? And number two, that there's going to be more hiring as a result of this to backfill positions. Now, with regards to number two, it's a little bit difficult to understand how this was phrased in the paragraph, whether SoFi is looking for a permanent replacement for Chad Borton, meaning that Paul Mayer is going to be a temporary shoe-in until they find a permanent replacement, or it could mean that they're searching for a replacement to essentially backfill Paul Mayer, so they're searching for a VP type level. The outstanding question here in my mind is Paul Mayer the permanent new president of SoFi Bank, or is he basically holding the seat until they can find a permanent replacement? And that's not very clear in how this is worded right now. Initially, I thought Paul Mayer was going to be very temporary, but as I reread it a couple more times, I think SoFi as a company is going to be looking for a replacement for Paul Mayer as a VP and to hand over some of those other responsibilities. And Paul Mayer is in fact the permanent replacement for Chad Borton. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts in the comments. So now let's look through Paul Mayer's CV. He's currently a vice president at SoFi Bank. He's focused primarily on strategy and operations. He's been with the company for about 4.5 years so far. Prior to SoFi, he's had a couple of different positions as an SVP, with his most prominent position being a senior vice president at Sallie Mae for 13 years. Now, a bit of digging from the SoFi community found that Paul Mayer was also originally tapped to be the president of SoFi Bank back in 2021, when the Golden Pacific Bancorp acquisition was made and SoFi was actually getting started with the banking side of their business. This was prior to Chad Borton even joining the company from USAA that same year. Highlighted here in the original press release, we can see at the very end of the announcement for the Golden Pacific Bancorp acquisition that Paul Mayer is going to assume the president of SoFi Bank. Now, of course, this didn't play out because Chad Borton came in from USAA, spent 2 years with SoFi to stand up that bank offering. We've had some tremendous results in the SoFi Bank segment so far, and now it's coming back to Paul Mayer, who is stepping up to that president role. The interesting part about this is that it comes just weeks after Aaron Webster moved over to PayPal. And you'll remember from a couple of previous videos that Webster was recently moved internally from the chief risk officer position. He was moved down to an SVP position, basically heading up Latin America, and replaced as the chief risk officer by a gentleman called Arun Pinto, who came from Wells Fargo, previously had JP Morgan experience. We've talked at length about this. Now, what happened with Webster was a month later, basically after this demotion, for lack of a better term, Webster resigned and moved to PayPal. And so naturally you might be wondering, but Tevis, wait a minute, what's going on here? What's happening? Why are all these things happening together? Well, it could have a big reason to do with the fact that the RSUs, the restricted stock units that vest as a form of compensation to these executives, vested very recently. So what we saw in my previous video, I showed that executives had been selling over the past 2 weeks to cover tax burdens as a result of these RSUs vesting. And as a result of that, obviously, if you're going to get your stock options and you're going to leave, you're going to wait until you get your stock options and then you're going to leave. So the stock options vesting could even serve as a catalyst to allow people to wait until that period happens before leaving, right? Now, there's a couple of arguments that you can make, obviously, to justify these pieces of news. Number one, we talked about Chad Borton being pulled out of retirement. This was some chatter around X today, and the entire idea that his role at SoFi was meant to be transitory, with the purpose of standing up the bank, making a smooth transition, and then, sailing off into the sunset. Now, I'm sure you could make this argument, and all of the offer letters for these executives are public information. I'm just throwing one up on the screen for you right now for Chad Borton. And yeah, there's a couple of terms in the fine print of his offer letter that points to this argument that you can make that, this is a temporary type of position with regards to how the stock vests, with regards to, having a severance or an exit clause, those types of things. And so while that wasn't explicitly highlighted, you could make a very valid, legitimate argument that his role was even meant to be temporary, just by contrasting some of the offer letters of, Anthony Noto and Chris Lapointe versus somebody like a Chad Borton. You could also argue in Webster's case that that departure was also justified because Webster was essentially demoted and replaced as the chief risk officer. So obviously, like, if I was demoted in my position today and I held a certain title and then I moved down to another title, yeah, obviously I would be looking to make a shift as well. I think that's anybody can say the same thing. And from a business perspective, it makes sense as well, because for SoFi to get Arun Pinto in that chief risk officer role, obviously they made a decision that they thought was best for their company's growth going forward. And not to mention that by moving to PayPal, Webster, he probably even got offered even more money than he was making at SoFi. So it works out as a win-win-win for everybody. And yes, you could make all of these arguments. And yes, I understand it's from a bullish lens. I'm painting it with rose-colored glasses. I get that. Don't get me wrong. While the arguments themselves can hold water, like, I can stand my ground in a debate to justify why Aaron Webster left, or maybe why Chad Borton even left. That's not my argument. My argument is strictly around the timing of these moves, because the timing is not ideal. And I think that anybody would agree with that. For any publicly traded company to have two major executives leave in 2 weeks, whatever the circumstances may be, it doesn't look good to the market. And that's the main thing that I want to highlight here. Having two major executives depart the company within 2 weeks of each other is not going to be perceived well by Wall Street, by retail, by institutions, by anybody really. People love drama. People love that gossip. Likely what this is going to be perceived as is some friction at the executive level, or, there's an underlying fear, of course, that translates into the execution of the business. In other words, if top executives start leaving the company, then that increases the execution risk associated with SoFi achieving their future forecasts, and it puts the entire bull thesis at strain, right? Because how many of you would leave SoFi if Anthony Noto left? A large amount, right? Because he's instrumental to the bull thesis. How many would leave if Chris Lapointe left? Probably some, but definitely a lower amount. And so you get my point. As these executives leave, they're crucial to parts of the bull thesis. And as a result, that part of the bull thesis is put in jeopardy. Now, it's obviously not as big of a deal if Aaron Webster or Chad Borton leaves as it would be if Chris Lapointe or Anthony Noto left, but you get my point. I'm not going so far as to say that that's the case right now. I'm just saying that that's the perception due to the proximity of these departures. They happen so quickly in succession that people are saying, what's going on with SoFi's management? Like, what's going on that's causing this friction that just made two executives leave, right? Now, of course, you can make all of those arguments, but bringing this back up 50,000 foot view and asking ourselves, in the end, does this really matter? The answer is no. In my mind, the answer is absolutely no. This does not change my bull thesis. This does not change the reason why I invested in SoFi. Chad Borton was not it. Aaron Webster was not it. Yes, them together in such a quick succession will give ammunition to the shorts and the bears. But in the long term, I think that I trust management's ability to make the best decision for shareholders. And that's backed by a long tenure of management not letting shareholders down in terms of their execution for their underlying business. And so I don't think it matters. All I'm saying is, in the short term, I wouldn't be surprised if there's negative analyst sentiment, if somebody writes a Seeking Alpha article and uses this as the ammunition to say there's internal strife at SoFi, executive level, whatever. SoFi can't achieve their goals because they can't even hold on to their executives. Whatever it may be, it's going to happen. And you and I, we will sigh and we'll roll our eyes and acknowledge the fact that this is just another negative piece of news that serves essentially as an overhang in the stock over the short term, and that's it. But at the end of the day, others are going to rejoice at this news because they know what they hold and they know that they hold it for the long term and that this is just noise. It's noise. It's short-term stuff. At the end of the day, I think it comes down to trusting management. And like I said before, I trust Noto to execute. I trust Lapointe to execute. I trust the vision laid out for SoFi's growth plan and that bull case in general. And I'm not swayed by a couple of executives leaving, right? I think that's what it comes down to. Do you trust management to make the right decisions on behalf of shareholders for the future of the business and the growth path that the business is on? Do you trust them to essentially lower that execution risk? Because if you don't, and that execution risk is very high, you don't have any confidence that management is going to execute. But if you do, then you know what you hold and you hold it for the long term. And as a result, you're probably happy that there is this short-term noise that's bringing the stock price down. You know, just from an incentive point of view, we know that the leadership team at SoFi is very incentivized to grow that business as effectively as they possibly can. And so if you're looking at it from that lens, then yeah, bring on all of the noise that you want in the short term. Just before I was about to hop on and record this video, short interest is now 23%. We're going to talk about that in a video at the end of the week more in depth. A lot of that comes as a result of, you know, these little pieces of news being on top, institutions shorting the business from a delta hedge perspective, so much negative sentiment out there, you know, people seeing the stock price and being pissed off. And at the end of the day, I think it comes down to that fundamental question that every investor holding SoFi has to ask themselves is, do I trust management to make the right decisions on my behalf as a shareholder and on behalf of SoFi, the underlying company, not the stock, the underlying company, to execute on their growth targets? And if the answer is still yes, then this is noise. If the answer is no, and Chad Borton and Aaron Webster were crucial to the bull thesis, then yeah, obviously that's going to be a bigger deal for you than for somebody who doesn't view them as instrumental. Not ideal timing, but executives leave companies all the time. It's nothing new. It happens all the time. So I wouldn't be looking too much into it. Of course, we're going to have a video on Friday talking about the news recap, talking about the short interest, because I thought that was more interesting pieces of news. But I really wanted to give some color behind the Chad Borton news because I think that a lot of people might be spiraling a little bit because two executives leaving in 2 weeks is definitely not a good look from face value. But if you dive a little bit deeper into it and you make some of those justifications and you understand some of the backstory, then you can have a more nuanced opinion on these pieces of news. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.